Bone dust tastes like chalk. That's what nobody tells you about the shot. They talk about windage, about the heartbeat pause, but they never mention the spray of limestone when a heavy round hits a barricade inches from your face. They definitely don't mention the men laughing beforehand. Grease permanently embedded itself under Cora's fingernails, tracing the cuticles in dark crescent moons. She scrubbed them with a stiff nylon brush over the stained sink in the team cage, but the carbon buildup from the Mark 13's bolt assembly was stubborn. It smelled like burnt sulfur and Hoppe's No. 9 solvent, a sharp chemical odor that had long ago replaced the scent of laundry detergent or shampoo in her life. She dried her hands on a rag that felt more like sandpaper. Her knuckles ached. A dull, rhythmic throb pulsed at the base of her right thumb, the result of carrying a 100-pound rucksack over jagged shale during last week's workup. She didn't massage the joint. Showing physical discomfort in this room was a currency she couldn't afford to spend. Behind her, the low murmur of the squad room hummed with its usual grating frequency. I'm just saying, the physical standards were adjusted. Mathematically, it's on paper. Briggs leaned back in a battered folding chair, balancing on the two rear legs. He tossed a crumpled dip wrapper at a rusted trash can and missed. You can't cheat biomechanics. 140 pounds of bone and muscle cannot absorb recoil or carry the load the same way 200 pounds can. It's not politics, it's physics. Wyatt, sitting across from him lacing his boots, grunted. He didn't look up, but his silence was an endorsement. Cora turned around, leaning her hips against the cold metal edge of the sink. She looked at Briggs. He wasn't a cartoon villain. He didn't sneer or twirl a mustache. He was a farm kid from Idaho who could run 6 miles in body armor without breathing hard. He genuinely believed she was going to get them killed. That was the exhausting part. It wasn't malice. It was a deeply rooted, unshakable conviction that she was a liability forced upon his team by politicians in suits. You talking about physics again, Briggs? Cora asked, her voice flat, devoid of the defensive edge she used to have a year ago. Because the last time you calculated a wind call, we missed the steel by 3 feet. A few guys at the far tables chuckled. Briggs dropped the front legs of his chair to the linoleum with a sharp clack. A flush of pink crawled up his thick neck. Steel doesn't shoot back, Cora, Briggs said, his tone dropping the casual frat house cadence, settling into something harder. Steel doesn't flank you in a wadi. When we're out there, and someone needs to drag my ass out of a kill zone, I want to know the person grabbing my drag handle has the mass to actually move me, not just tug at my vest and give it a good college try. She looked at his broad chest, the thick ropes of muscle in his arms. He was right. If Briggs went down in full kit, he'd weigh close to 280 pounds. Dragging him would tear her shoulders out of their sockets, but she wouldn't let him die. She'd break her own bones doing it. She just couldn't prove that in a locker room. Don't get shot, then, Cora said quietly. She walked past him, grabbing her pelican case. She felt the eyes on her back, the silent, collective assessment of her hips, her shoulders, the way she walked. Just a girl. It was a phrase she had heard whispered in the hallways of Coronado, murmured in the mess hall, typed in anonymous forums. It wasn't the blatant screaming in her face that wore her down. It was the micro hesitations, the way Wyatt double-checked her knot on a fast rope rig, the way Sullivan, her own spotter, sometimes verified her range calculations when he thought she wasn't looking. It made her hands shake. Not from fear, but from a suppressed, suffocating frustration. 2 hours later, they were crammed in the troop compartment of an MH-47 Chinook. The heat was immediate and oppressive, smelling of raw kerosene and hydraulic fluid. The twin rotors beat against the dense night air, vibrating right through the soles of her boots into her teeth. Red jump lights painted the faces of the men in her platoon. They looked like statues. Hard, unreadable, entirely at home in the violent tremor of the aircraft. Cora sat near the ramp, her rifle secured between her knees. She squeezed her eyes shut. Her stomach churned a mix of the MRE she had forced down earlier and the adrenaline that always dumped into her bloodstream too early. She hated this part. The ride was when the mind wandered, when the doubts Briggs planted started to germinate. Am I strong enough for this altitude? What if my grip slips? What if I misread the mirage? She opened her eyes and focused on the texture of her rifle's stock. It was stippled, rough against her bare fingers. She traced the familiar grooves. She didn't need to be 200 pounds to pull a 3-pound trigger. She just needed to be right. The insertion was a brutal, lungs-on-fire slog. They stepped off the ramp into pitch blackness and a landscape composed entirely of jagged limestone and loose scree. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Cora's pack weighed 92 pounds. The shoulder straps bit into her clavicle like dull wire. Within 20 minutes, the sweat had soaked through her combat shirt, freezing instantly against her skin in the high-altitude chill. She walked behind Sullivan, matching his stride. She didn't pant. She breathed through her nose, regulating her heart rate, forcing the oxygen into her burning muscles. Don't fall out, don't trip, don't give them a reason. They climbed for 3 hours. The target was a walled compound nestled in the crook of a deep valley. Intelligence suggested it was a transit hub for moving heavy weaponry. The assault element Briggs, Wyatt, and 10 others would breach the lower walls. Cora and Sullivan were tasked with overwatch on a crumbling ridge that jutted out above the valley floor, offering a severe downward angle on the objective. By the time they reached the hide site, Cora's thighs were trembling. She dropped into a prone position on the flat roof of a bombed-out mud brick structure, her chest heaving against the dust. It smelled like ancient dirt, goat manure, and dried clay. "You good?" Sullivan whispered, unrolling his spotting map beside her. "I'm fine," she snapped, a little too quickly. She unclipped her pack, dragged it in front of her, and rested the rifle's bipod on it to elevate the muzzle above the low parapet. Dawn bled into the sky like a bruised peach. The cold vanished, replaced by an aggressive, searing heat that radiated off the rocks. Cora adjusted her scope, dialing in the magnification. The compound below came into sharp, agonizingly clear focus. 1,140 meters. It was a long poke. The angle was steep, which meant gravity would affect the bullet differently than on flat ground. She checked her Kestrel wind meter. The wind was swirling in the valley, bouncing off the canyon walls in chaotic, unpredictable currents. "Reading a full value from the left, maybe 8 miles an hour up here," Sullivan murmured, his eye pressed to his spotting scope. "Down in the bowl, it's tumbling. Look at the dust kicking up by the south wall." Cora saw it, a faint, swirling devil of sand near the primary breach point. The wind was moving right to left down there. It would push her bullet one way at the apex of its trajectory, and then push it the opposite way as it dropped into the valley. Her stomach tightened. A mathematician's nightmare. "I see it," Cora said. Her voice was steady, but inside, a cold coil of anxiety tightened. She dry-fired once to feel the break of the trigger. It was crisp, perfect. Down in the valley, tiny green infrared lasers sliced through the lingering twilight. The assault team was in position. Through her comms earpiece, she heard Wyatt's voice, a tight whisper. "Breaching in 3, 2. A dull thud echoed up the canyon walls, followed instantly by a plume of gray smoke at the compound's gate. The team flowed inside like water. For 30 seconds, the radio was dead silent. Cora tracked them through her scope, sweeping the courtyards, the upper windows, the rooftops. Nothing. Then, the world tore open. It didn't sound like a movie. It sounded like someone dropping a dumpster full of metal tools from a 10-story building. A deafening, chaotic crash of overlapping gunfire. "Contact! Heavy contact! Interior courtyard!" Briggs's voice screamed over the radio. The calm was gone. The professionalism was entirely replaced by the raw, panicked pitch of a man staring at his own death. "We're pinned, south wall." Taking heavy PKM fire from the second deck, Cora shifted her rifle. She found the second deck of the main structure. A muzzle flash the size of a beach ball was strobing in a darkened window. The heavy machine gun was tearing the south wall apart, ripping through the mud brick where the assault team was hiding. "Target acquired. Second deck, middle window," Cora said, her breathing suddenly shallow. "Wind is shifting," Sullivan warned, his voice tight. 10 miles an hour left to right at the crest. Unreadable in the bowl. "It's a guess, Cora." "I need a call, Sully." "Hold left edge of the window. Elevation. Dial 11.2 mils." Cora dialed the turret on her scope. Her hands were slick with sweat. The sun was baking the back of her neck. Through the glass, she saw the PKM gunner's silhouette. He was firing in long, sustained bursts. He wasn't stopping. He was going to chew right through that wall and kill Briggs and Wyatt. "I don't have a clear shot at his center of mass," Cora said. Her crosshairs floated over the muzzle flash, but the angle was blocked by a wooden beam. "I can only see his shoulder and part of his head." "Cora, they're getting torn to pieces down there," Sullivan said, panic finally leaking into his tone. "Take the shot." She settled her cheek against the stock. The vibrations of the chopper, the exhaustion of the climb, the mocking laughter in the locker room, it all funneled down into a singular, sharp point of focus. She closed her eyes for a microsecond. You can't cheat biomechanics, Briggs's voice echoed in her memory. Her heart hammered against the hard dirt roof. Thump, thump, thump. She opened her eyes. The crosshairs rested precisely on the left edge of the wooden window frame. She had to trust the wind to carry the bullet perfectly into the sliver of exposed flesh. She exhaled, letting all the air out of her lungs until there was nothing left but stillness. The world muted. The ringing in her ears faded. The smell of dust and cordite vanished. Her finger pressed the trigger. It didn't feel like a conscious decision. It was just an inevitability. The rifle roared, slamming back into her bruised shoulder with the force of a hammer strike. The muzzle brake kicked up a massive cloud of gray dust, blinding her right eye for a fraction of a second. She kept her cheek welded to the stock, fighting the recoil, racking the bolt back violently to chamber another round, her eyes straining through the scope to see the impact. "Impact," Sullivan whispered. His voice sounded hollow, shocked. Down in the valley, the heavy, rhythmic hammering of the PKM had stopped instantly. Smoke leaked from the ejection port, curling upward in a thin, acrid ribbon. Cora didn't watch it. Her eye remained fused to the glass. Down in the valley, the second-story window was a dark, silent void. The strobe of the machine gun was gone. A heavy, unnatural quiet settled over the radio net. "Target is down," Sullivan muttered. He pulled away from the spotting scope, wiping a streak of dirt and sweat from his forehead. He looked at her, really looked at her. "Keep your eyes on the glass, Sully," she snapped. Her voice was raspy, dry as the limestone dust coating her tongue. Down in the courtyard, Wyatt's voice crackled through the earpiece, breathless and laced with static. "Good hit, Overwatch, moving to clear the structure." "No thanks, no apologies, just tactical progression. That was fine. She didn't want gratitude, she wanted them alive." For 10 minutes, the radio fed them fragmented audio of the assault. Flashbangs thumping like distant thunder, the sharp, controlled double taps of suppressed M4S. The smell of her fired casing still lingered, a sharp tang of ammonia and scorched brass. Her right shoulder throbbed with a dull, spreading ache where the heavy MK-13 had kicked her. The biomechanics Briggs loved to preach about were real. She felt the recoil deeper in her joints than a larger man would. But she managed it. She absorbed the violence and stayed on target. Then the radio erupted again. "Squirters! Multiple dismounts pushing out the rear gate!" Briggs yelled. "They're flanking east into the wadi!" Cora swung the heavy barrel to the left. Her bipod dragged across the rough mud roof with a harsh scrape. Through the scope, the magnified heat mirage distorted the desert floor like a funhouse mirror. She tracked past the compound walls, scanning the dry riverbed that snaked eastward. There, 6 men, moving fast. They weren't fleeing, they were bounding methodically, utilizing the deep cuts of the wadi for cover. They were moving to flank the assault element from behind, while the team was trapped inside the structure. "Sully, East Wadi, 600 meters, she called out, her heart rate spiking again. "I have them," Sullivan said, his eye slammed back against his eyepiece. "Moving right to left. Wind is quartering toward us now, maybe 5 miles. Hold right edge. Drop down to 4.5 mils. This wasn't a calculated, breath-holding precision shot. This was rapid engagement, ugly, fast, and desperate. She led the first runner, placing the crosshairs just ahead of his chest. She didn't wait for the perfect pause in her heartbeat. She ripped the trigger. The rifle bucked. She violently threw the bolt back, ejected the spent brass, slammed a new round home, and reacquired her sight picture in less than 2 seconds. The first man was tumbling into the dirt. "Hit. Next target, trailing guy," Sullivan called, his voice a metronome of clinical detachment. She fired again. Missed. The bullet kicked up a spout of sand just behind the runner's heel. "Miss, right. Wind picked up," Sullivan corrected instantly. "Hold center mass." Cora gritted her teeth. Her shoulders screamed as she absorbed another concussive blast. She cycled the action. The heavy bolt was getting hot, the friction of the metal biting through her thin tactical gloves. She fired. The trailing man dropped, his rifle clattering against the rocks. 4 left. They realized they were being hunted from above and scrambled for the deeper crevices of the wadi. "They're finding dead space," Sullivan warned. "If they get past that bend, we lose line of sight, and they have a direct path to the breach point." Cora's breathing grew ragged. The sun was fully up now, blindingly bright, baking the black metal of her rifle. Sweat pooled in her eye protection, stinging her right eye. She couldn't blink it away. She tracked the lead runner as he scrambled up a low embankment, trying to cross a small gap to better cover. She fired. The recoil drove the stock into her collarbone. She cycled, fired, fired. It was a brutal, mechanical rhythm. There was no elegance here. No Hollywood sniper holding a zen-like calm. It was brute force. It was muscling a heavy weapon system back onto target while her muscles screamed in protest, fighting the adrenaline tremors in her forearms. 2 down. Last 2 are pinned behind a boulder, Sullivan said, his breath hitching. You got them all. Cora stopped. She lowered her head to the side of the rifle, her cheek resting on the hot, dusty receiver. Her lungs pulled at the thin mountain air in greedy, desperate gasps. The right side of her neck was cramping violently. The metallic taste of adrenaline and dehydration flooded her mouth. She had fired 5 rounds in 20 seconds. 140 pounds of bone and muscle, absorbing over 100 pounds of raw kinetic energy, over and over. Overwatch, this is Assault 1. Briggs's voice came over the net. It sounded different. The panic was gone, replaced by a heavy, winded exhaustion. East Wadi is clear. We have the primary target secured. SSE is complete. We are moving to exfil. Cora keyed her mic. Her thumb trembled on the PTT button. Copy, Assault 1. Overwatch is cold. See you at the LZ. She didn't wait for a response. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the blinding blue Afghan sky. The sky didn't care about what had just happened. It was vastly, insultingly empty. Beside her, Sullivan was quietly packing his spotting scope. He didn't offer a high five. He didn't tell her she was a badass. He just handed her a half-empty Nalgene bottle. She took it, her hand shaking so badly she spilled water down her chin and onto her armor. It was lukewarm and tasted like plastic, but it was the best thing she had ever swallowed. Gravity is a vicious debt collector. The descent to the landing zone was worse than the climb. Loose shale gave way under their boots with every step, threatening to send them tumbling down the sheer faces of the mountain. Cora's knees absorbed the shock of the 92-pound pack, the cartilage grinding in a way that promised early arthritis. The high from the engagement had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, nauseating fatigue. They linked up with the assault element at the base of a dry riverbed 2 miles from the extraction point. The men were covered in chalky white dust and drying blood. Wyatt had a crude bandage wrapped tightly around his forearm, a graze from shrapnel. Briggs was carrying a heavy rucksack bulging with captured hard drives and intel, plus his own gear. He looked like a draft horse pushed to the brink of collapse. Nobody spoke. The tactical situation required silence, but this silence felt different. It was heavy, saturated. As they formed a staggered column for the final push, Briggs suddenly stumbled. His boot caught on a submerged root, and with 130 pounds of gear on his back, he couldn't correct his balance. He pitched forward, landing hard on his chest with a sickening crunch. A sharp, involuntary groan escaped his lips. The column stopped. Wyatt moved to help him, but Briggs waved him off, struggling to push himself up. His face was gray. He was favoring his left leg, his ankle clearly rolled and swelling fast inside the rigid boot.
"I'm good,"
Briggs grunted, though his voice was a strained wheeze. He tried to put weight on the leg and instantly collapsed back into the dirt, biting down on a curse. The LZ was still a mile away. The Chinook was 5 minutes out. They couldn't afford to slow down. The sun was exposing them entirely in the open valley. Cora didn't think. She just moved. She stepped out of the formation, walking back to where Briggs lay in the dirt. He looked up at her, his jaw set in a hard defensive line, waiting for the pity or the "I told you so." He expected her to call for one of the other guys. Instead, Cora dropped to one knee. She unclipped her own heavy pack, letting it crash into the dust. Then, she unslung her sniper rifle, securing it across her chest. "Give me the intel, Ruck," she said. Her voice was completely devoid of emotion. Briggs stared at her. "Cora, it weighs." "I know what it weighs, Briggs. Take it off." He unbuckled the chest strap, his hands clumsy with pain. Cora grabbed the reinforced drag handle of the massive pack. She didn't try to sling it over her shoulders. She couldn't carry both that and her rifle securely. Instead, she wrapped the nylon strap around her left wrist, twice, locking it into her grip. "Wyatt, get under his right shoulder," Cora commanded, not looking back. "Sully, grab my pack." She didn't wait to see if they obeyed. She locked her elbow, braced her core, and started walking. The dead weight of Briggs's intel ruck dragged behind her, plowing a deep trench in the sand. It felt like her shoulder socket was going to tear open. The nylon strap dug into her wrist, cutting off circulation, burning her skin raw. Every step was a localized agony. Her thighs screamed, her lungs burned, and the metallic taste returned to the back of her throat. She didn't look at Briggs, who was limping heavily beside her, leaning on Wyatt. She just stared at the dirt, 10 feet in front of her boots, counting her steps. 1, 2, 3. Don't stop. Don't drop it. The biomechanics were entirely against her. She was dragging nearly 60 pounds of dead weight through loose sand with one arm, after firing heavy caliber rounds all morning, after climbing a mountain. According to the math, she should have failed. According to the physics, she was inadequate. But human will doesn't exist on a spreadsheet. Spite is a highly effective fuel source, and a refusal to be the weak link is stronger than gravity. They broke through the tree line just as the heavy, thumping rhythm of the MH-47's rotors beat the air above them. The massive helicopter flared, kicking up a blinding sandstorm as it touched down. Cora dragged the pack all the way up the ramp. Only when she was entirely inside the darkened cabin, past the loadmaster, did she finally let go. Her fingers were locked in a rigid claw. She had to use her right hand to pry her left fingers open. She slumped against the aluminum bulkhead, her head tipping back against the vibration of the fuselage. She closed her eyes. She didn't have the energy to unstrap her helmet. Her entire left arm was numb. The ramp closed, sealing out the blinding light and the dust. The jump lights snapped on, painting the cabin in that familiar bloody red glow. She felt a presence shift next to her. She opened one eye. Briggs was sitting on the canvas bench beside her. He had a chemical ice pack pressed against his swollen ankle. The dirt on his face was streaked with sweat, and he looked older, weathered. He didn't look at her immediately. He stared straight ahead at the opposite bulkhead, the chaotic vibration of the chopper shaking them both. The noise was too deafening to speak at a normal volume. Briggs reached into his cargo pocket. He pulled out a battered, dust-covered canteen. He unscrewed the cap and held it out toward her. It wasn't an apology. Apologies were cheap and useless in this environment. It was an acknowledgement, an offering. Cora looked at the canteen. Then she looked at Briggs. She didn't smile. She didn't nod in some dramatic display of forgiveness. She just took the canteen, her bruised hand shaking slightly, and took a long, slow drink. The water was metallic and warm. It tasted perfect. She handed it back. Briggs screwed the cap on and leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. Cora looked down at her hands. The grease and carbon were completely gone, scrubbed away by sand, sweat, and friction. Her knuckles were raw, her cuticles bleeding. They weren't the hands of a girl playing dress-up in a man's world. They were the hands of a rifleman. The flight back to the FOB was silent, save for the roar of the engines. When they finally landed and trudged back into the team cage, the atmosphere had fundamentally altered. It wasn't that she had suddenly become one of the boys. She didn't want to be. She was Cora. As she sat down at the sink to begin the long, tedious process of scrubbing down her bolt assembly, she heard a chair scrape behind her. Wyatt walked past, dropping a clean, oil-soaked rag next to her rifle parts. He didn't say a word. He just kept walking toward the showers. A moment later, Briggs limped past, leaning heavily on a crutch he'd sourced from the medics. He paused by the sink. He looked at the heavy Mark 13 receiver sitting in pieces on the metal counter. Wind was erratic down in the bowl, Briggs said, his voice gravelly, lacking the arrogant bass it had carried that morning. It was, Cora replied without looking up, carefully brushing carbon off the firing pin. That was a hell of a call, hell of a shot. Cora stopped brushing. She didn't turn around, but she let the nylon brush rest against the metal. The scent of Hoppe's No. 9 solvent filled the air between them. It smelled like work. It smelled like belonging. "It's not math, Briggs," she said quietly, staring at the grease on her hands. "It's just knowing the job." Briggs stood there for a second longer, the silence stretching out, heavy and real. Then he nodded once, though she couldn't see it. He limped away, the rubber tip of his crutch squeaking against the linoleum. Cora picked up her rag. She started to wipe down the bolt, feeling the smooth, machined steel beneath her battered fingers. The dull throb in her thumb was still there, but it didn't bother her anymore. It was just a reminder that the physical toll was the price of admission. She had paid it in full, and she would pay it again tomorrow. The team cage hummed around her, the low murmur of voices returning, but the frequency had changed. It wasn't grating anymore, it was just noise. She was finally, simply, part of it. That's the end of the line for this mission. If Cora's Grit gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story. Share this with anyone who knows what it takes to silence the doubters with pure, undeniable action. What did you think of that silent moment on the chopper? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.